Steph Curry was sitting in the familiar red chair on the First Take set, discreetly adjusting his lapel microphone while technicians made the final audio adjustments. It was his fourth time as a guest on ESPN's most controversial show, but this time something felt different in the air. To understand how 15 seconds of absolute silence would redefine what wisdom means in sports media, we need to go back to the exact moment when the king of provocation met someone who was playing a completely different game. Because you can perceive that there are environments created for civilized debates and others built for television warfare. First Take definitely belonged to the second category. The First Take studio had that characteristic electric energy of a live show. The heat of the spotlights, the constant sound of equipment running, and that dense atmosphere that only existed when millions of people were watching in real time. Molly Karim, the moderator, was leafing through her notes while receiving final instructions from the director through her earpiece. On the other side of the U-shaped table, Steph A. Smith adjusted his tie with the precision of a general preparing for battle. 30 seconds to air, announced someone from production. Curry smiled and waved to the technical crew, that natural tranquility that characterized him contrasting drastically with the palpable intensity of the environment around him. In 15 years of career, he had given hundreds of interviews, but there was something about First Take that always elevated the tension level. And we're live in 3, 2, 1. Good morning, and welcome to First Take. Molly opened the show with her characteristic professional energy. I'm Molly Karim, and today we have a very special guest with us in a special edition of the show. Steph Curry, two-time MVP, four-time NBA champion, and widely considered the greatest shooter in basketball history. Curry waved to the cameras, that genuine smile that had won fans worldwide. Steph, thank you for being here with us, Molly continued. Let's start by talking about the Warriors. You're on a 5-game winning streak. You're playing at an absurdly high level at 36 years old. How do you explain this longevity? It was the type of typical First Take warm-up question. Respectful, but opening the way for deeper conversations. Curry leaned slightly forward, his hands gesturing naturally while he spoke. Well, Molly, I think a lot of it has to do with taking care of the body, but mainly with love for the game. When you wake up every day genuinely excited to play basketball, it becomes easier to make all the necessary sacrifices to stay at a high level. Steph A. listened in silence, his eyes fixed on Curry like a predator studying prey. Naturally, this leads us to the moment when you realize that certain people don't ask warm-up questions for very long. Steph A. interrupted softly, his voice carrying that specific cadence that show fans immediately recognized as a prelude to something explosive. Let's talk about reality here. Curry turned to him, maintaining the same calm expression, but Marcus Williams, who was watching from outside the set, felt a familiar tension in his stomach. He had known Steph A. for years, knew how to recognize when the journalist was about to leave the comfort zone. I tremendously respect your career, Steph A. continued, gesturing theatrically with his hands. 4 championships changed the game forever with the three-point shot. Nobody questions your legacy. But the word "but" echoed through the studio like distant thunder announcing a storm. Let's be honest about what we're seeing on the court. You're 36 years old. Your numbers are dropping compared to your peak. The team is depending more on the young guys. The Western Conference is more competitive than ever. Molly watched attentively, recognizing the pattern. Steph A. was building his argument brick by brick, as he always did before asking the question he really wanted to ask. Curry listened patiently, without interrupting. That maturity he had developed throughout a career dealing with all kinds of provocation and questioning. How is it possible for a person to feel exactly the moment when a conversation is about to take a completely different direction? Everyone in the studio, from Curry to the camera operators, knew that Steph A was preparing for something bigger. Steph A said, his voice gaining that specific intensity that made TV producers salivate and press officers sweat. I need to ask a question that I know you won't like, but that someone needs to ask. The studio became imperceptibly quieter. Cameras automatically adjusted focus. Molly prepared to intervene if necessary. Marcus Williams, from outside, crossed his arms in defensive position. Curry, in turn, maintained the same relaxed posture, but there was something in his eyes. Not fear or irritation, but a more focused attention, as if he were preparing to navigate waters he knew were dangerous. Some questions are asked to inform the public, Curry thought to himself, echoing something he had learned over years dealing with media. Others are asked to create controversy. Steph A made a dramatic pause, looking directly at Curry, then at the main camera, then back to Curry. It was a tested and approved technique, building tension to the point where the audience was literally on the edge of their seats waiting to see what would come next. When, Steph A said, each word pronounced with surgical precision, "Are you going to stop pretending?" The silence that followed lasted only 2 seconds, but seemed like an eternity. It's impossible not to feel how certain words can carry weight disproportionate to their size. The phrase, "stop pretending," hung in the studio air like an accusation, a provocation, a direct challenge not just to the player, but to the man sitting in that chair. Molly leaned slightly forward, ready to control the situation if necessary. The cameras captured every micro-expression on Curry's face, which remained calm, but clearly processing what he had just heard. "Stop pretending what, Steph A?" Curry asked, his voice maintaining the same respectful tone, but with a hint of genuine curiosity. And it was then that Steph A. Smith, at 56 years old, after 3 decades provoking professional athletes, asked the question he thought would be his moment of television glory, but which would become the moment when he would learn a lesson he didn't know he needed to learn. When are you going to stop pretending that you're still an elite player and finally admit that it's time to retire? The question fell like a bomb in the center of the studio. How many times in life do we witness the exact moment when a calculated provocation meets someone prepared to transform it into something completely different? Curry didn't look away. He didn't show anger or irritation. Instead, he did something that Steph A. Smith, in 30 years of career, wasn't prepared to face. He smiled genuinely and said the 2 words that would change the entire course of that conversation. "Thank you, Steph A." What happened next? Nobody, not Steph A., not Molly, not the millions of viewers, was prepared to hear. "Thank you, Steph A." The 2 words echoed through the First Take studio like a stone thrown into a perfectly calm lake. Steph A. Smith, who had spent the last 2 minutes carefully building his sharpest provocation, blinked twice in a row, clearly not expecting that reaction. Molly Karam leaned slightly forward, her years of experience as a moderator telling her that something extraordinary was about to happen. Marcus Williams, watching from outside the set, relaxed his shoulders for the first time since Steph A. had started talking. Because you can perceive that there are moments in live television when you feel you're about to witness something that will be replayed for years. This was clearly one of those moments. Curry maintained direct contact with Steph A., that genuine smile still present in his voice, But there was something deeper in his tone now. Not irritation or defensiveness, but a clarity that came from someone who had thought deeply about exactly these questions. "Thank you," he repeated, leaning slightly forward, "because that's exactly the kind of question I ask myself every day." Steph A opened his mouth to say something, but Curry continued with that natural tranquility that characterized not only his personality, but his approach to everything in life. "You ask me when I'm going to stop pretending that I'm still elite. Steph A, let me tell you when I'll know it's time to stop." The studio became quieter than it normally was during first take. The sound technicians unconsciously adjusted their equipment, as if they wanted to make sure every word would be captured with perfection. Naturally, this leads us to the moment when you realize that some answers don't come from preparation or media training, but from a much deeper and more authentic place. "I'll know it's time to retire the day I wake up in the morning and don't feel that spark anymore." He paused, not for dramatic effect, but as if he were accessing real memories while speaking. You know that feeling when you wake up, and the first thing that comes to mind is, "Man, I'm going to play basketball today?" When you feel energy in your chest just thinking about stepping on the court, competing, trying to make impossible shots that everyone says you shouldn't try? Steph A listened with an attention he rarely demonstrated when others spoke. There was something in Curry's authenticity that was impossible to ignore or interrupt. "When that feeling stops existing," Curry continued, "when waking up in the morning becomes just another work day instead of another opportunity to do something special, then I'll know it's time." Molly watched, fascinated. In 15 years moderating sports debates, she had heard thousands of defensive, aggressive political responses, but she had rarely witnessed someone respond to an attack with such honest vulnerability. "But here's the thing, Steph A," Curry said, and there was something in his tone that made the journalist lean slightly forward. "That spark has nothing to do with statistics or what other people think about me being finished or not." It was the first time Curry had used air quotes, and he did it with a smile that didn't have a trace of malice. "The spark has to do with love. Love for the game, love for competition, love for trying to be better today than I was yesterday. And as long as I feel that, as long as I wake up excited to train, to play, to try to help my team win." Curry made another pause, and this time you could feel he was reaching the central point of his response. "Why would I stop? Why would anyone stop doing something they love just because other people think they should? How is it possible for a question designed to embarrass someone to transform into a moment of genuine reflection about passion and purpose?" Steph A was discovering in real time. "Actually," Curry said, and there was a gentleness in his voice that completely transformed the energy of the conversation. "Let me ask you a question, Steph A." Steph A. Smith, who had made a career asking questions, suddenly found himself in the opposite position. Molly turned slightly to observe his reaction. "You've been in this profession for, what, 30 years? Have you ever had moments when people said you should stop, that it's past time, that your opinions are too controversial, or that you're getting too old to understand the new generation of athletes?" The question hung in the air for a few seconds. Steph A. nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression taking the place of the provocative intensity that had dominated his face minutes before. "And in those moments," Curry continued, "what was the criterion you used to decide to continue? Was it what other people thought about you, or was it how you felt about what you were doing? Something that touches deeply is how certain questions can function as mirrors, forcing us to examine our own motivations and choices." Steph A was being confronted not with aggressiveness, but with a reflection he hadn't seen coming. "I imagine," Curry said, his voice maintaining that conversational tone that made the interaction seem more like a conversation between friends than a televised interview, "that you continued because you still felt passion for what you did, because you still woke up excited to talk about sports, to debate, to provoke interesting conversations." Steph A. remained silent, but it was a different silence from what normally characterized his first take appearances. It was a reflective silence. "That's exactly what happens to me with basketball," Curry explained. "It's not about proving anything to anyone. It's not about statistics or recognition. It's about waking up every day still passionate about what I do." Molly looked at Steph A., waiting for a response, but he seemed to be processing something much deeper than a simple exchange of television arguments. "When that passion is gone," Curry concluded, "I'll be the first to know, and I'll retire with the same joy I had playing. Until then." He smiled again, but this time there was something almost paternal in his expression. "I'm going to continue honoring that passion, and I hope you do the same with yours." What happened next was something that First Take fans had never witnessed in 15 years of the show. Steph A. Smith was genuinely speechless. It wasn't the strategic silence he sometimes used for dramatic effect. It wasn't the calculated pause before an explosive response. It was the silence of someone who had been confronted with a perspective he hadn't considered, presented in a way that was impossible to argue against. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. Molly looked at Steph A., then Curry, then back to Steph A., clearly realizing she was witnessing something extraordinary. The show's director, watching from the monitors in the control room, gestured for the cameras to capture the expression on Steph A.'s face, a mixture of surprise, reflection, and something that seemed very close to admiration. 15 seconds of silence on live television is an eternity. 15 seconds of Steph A. Smith in silence on First Take was practically a miracle. When he finally opened his mouth to speak, the words that came out were not what anyone in the studio, including himself, expected to hear. "Steph," he said, his voice carrying a quality no one had heard before in his decades of career. "That was—" He stopped again, searching for the right words. It's impossible not to feel how certain conversations can change not only what we think about other people, but what we think about ourselves. Steph A. Smith was having one of those conversations on national television. "That was the best answer I've ever received in 30 years asking that question." The admission echoed through the studio like a confession. Molly smiled involuntarily. Marcus Williams, watching from outside, felt a wave of pride that had nothing to do with public relations and everything to do with human character. But what came next would be even more surprising. "That was the best answer I've ever received in 30 years asking that question." Steph A. Smith's words echoed through the First Take studio like a public confession that no one, not even himself, had planned to make. Molly Karam followed with an expression that mixed surprise and professional admiration. In 15 years moderating debates, she had rarely heard Steph A. be so vulnerable. Curry remained in the same relaxed position, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he, too, was processing the magnitude of what had just happened. Not every day does someone leave Steph A. Smith genuinely speechless on national television. You can perceive that there are moments that transform not only those who speak, but those who listen. This was clearly one of those moments. Steph A. Smith didn't get where he was by being easily silenced. 3 decades of journalistic career had taught him that admitting an intellectual defeat could be transformed into a victory if handled correctly. But this time, something was different. "You know what?" he said, leaning back in his chair for the first time since the show had started. "I spent the last 15 minutes preparing a battery of arguments about numbers, about athletic decline, about realities of professional sports." He spoke with his hands, but not in the theatrical way that characterized his usual provocations. There was something more reflective in his tone now. "And you came here and asked me a question that I, honestly, didn't expect." Molly took advantage of the opening. "Steph A., in all these years asking difficult questions to athletes, when was the last time one of them turned the game around this way?" Steph A. paused. Not his calculated dramatic pause, but a genuine pause from someone really thinking about the answer. Naturally, this leads us to the moment when you realize that even the most experienced provocateurs can find themselves in the position of being provoked by life itself. "Molly," Steph A. began, his voice carrying a more introspective quality than anyone had heard before, "I think it was never." He addressed Curry directly. "Not this way. Usually, when I ask a question like that, I get one of 3 responses. Either the person gets defensive and attacks back, or they give a safe political answer, or they get visibly irritated and the interview gets tense." Curry listened with the same respectful attention he had shown throughout the conversation. "But you," Steph A. continued, "you took my question, which, let's be honest, was designed to put you on the defensive, and transformed it into an opportunity for genuine reflection. Not just about you, but about all of us." There was something almost admiring in his voice now. "And when you turned the question back to me, man, it was like looking in a mirror in a way I hadn't looked in a long time." Molly felt she was witnessing something rare, a genuine conversation happening in the middle of a show that normally relied on conflict and heated debate. "Steph," she said, addressing Curry, "did you plan this response, or was it spontaneous?" Curry smiled. "Totally spontaneous. But you know, Molly, that's a question I ask myself constantly. Not about retirement specifically, but about motivation, about why we do what we do." He looked at Steph A. again. And when Steph A. asked the question the way he did, I thought, this is a perfect opportunity to share something I really believe, instead of just giving a defensive answer. Steph A. nodded slowly. "And that was exactly what I didn't expect." How is it possible for a question asked to create conflict to transform into a bridge for mutual understanding? The 2 men were discovering in real time. "Let me tell you something, Steph A.," Curry said, his voice gaining a more personal quality. "I know you have a reputation for asking difficult questions, and I respect that. Sports journalism needs people who aren't afraid to go beyond the superficial." Steph A. listened with genuine attention. "The question is, how do we do this by elevating the conversation instead of just provoking reactions? Your question today, however direct it was, gave me an opportunity to talk about something that really matters to me." "And it made me reflect on my own motivations," Steph A. admitted. "When you asked about my passion for journalism, man, I hadn't stopped to think about it that way in years." Molly watched, fascinated. "You, too, are demonstrating exactly how a difficult conversation can be productive when both parties are really listening to each other. Something that touches deeply is how certain interactions can elevate all the people involved, transforming a moment that could have been destructive into something constructive." "You know what the irony is?" Steph A. said, a genuine smile appearing on his face for the first time since the conversation had taken this direction. "I came here thinking I was going to teach you something about the realities of professional sports?" Curry laughed. "And I learned something too. I learned that even the most provocative questions can come from a place of genuine interest in better understanding people." "Exactly." Steph A. got excited, but not in the exaggerated way that characterized his usual television moments. "That's the difference between provoking for the sake of provoking and provoking to understand." Molly leaned forward. "Steph A., will this change how you approach future interviews?" The question hung in the air for a few seconds. Steph A. Smith, known for his quick and confident responses, was clearly thinking deeply about the answer. "Molly," he finally said, "I think so. Not that I'm going to stop asking difficult questions. That's my job, and I believe it's important. But maybe I can ask these questions in a way that opens space for the kind of conversation we just had." Curry leaned slightly forward. "Steph A., can I share something with you?" "Please." "When you asked that question about retirement, my first internal reaction was irritation. For a few seconds, I wanted to respond defensively, maybe even aggressively." Steph A. listened attentively. "But then I thought, what if I use this as an opportunity to talk about something that really matters?" And that's what changed the entire dynamic. "That's incredible," Steph A. said, "because my original intention was exactly to provoke a defensive reaction. That's what I was expecting." Molly shook her head. "You're demonstrating something very powerful about choice, about how we can choose how to respond to situations, even when they catch us by surprise. It's impossible not to feel how certain conversations can function as masterclasses about human communication, even when they happen spontaneously on live television." The show's director, watching from the monitors in the control room, was making frantic signals for the cameras to keep recording. Dirtinau, 15 years producing sports television, he had never witnessed something like this happen live. Marcus Williams, observing from outside the set, felt a mixture of professional pride and personal admiration. It wasn't just about public relations or image management. It was about watching someone he respected navigate a difficult situation with grace and authenticity. "You know what else impresses me about this conversation?" Molly said, looking at both men. "It's that you transformed what could have been a moment of confrontation into a moment of mutual growth." Steph A. nodded. "And it makes me think about how many opportunities I've missed over the years to have really meaningful conversations because I was too focused on winning the debate." "And I learned," Curry added, "that even the most provocative questions can come from a legitimate place of curiosity about who we are as people." Naturally, this leads us to the moment when you realize that some of life's best lessons arrive disguised as our greatest challenges. "So," Molly said, looking at the cameras, "what started as a question about retirement transformed into a conversation about passion, purpose, and the art of respectful communication." Steph A. laughed. "Molly, I honestly don't know how we're going to go back to normal debates after this." Curry smiled. "Maybe we don't need to. Maybe this is a new way to have difficult conversations." "You just demonstrated," Molly said, "that it's possible to disagree, challenge, and provoke each other while maintaining mutual respect and creating space for real growth." Steph A. looked directly at the main camera. "And I have to say to our audience, this was more valuable to me than any debate I've ever had on this show." The studio fell silent for a moment, not the uncomfortable silence from the beginning of the conversation, but a satisfied silence of people who knew they had just witnessed something special. "When we return," Molly announced, as the intermission music began to play, We'll talk about what this means for the future of public discourse. But while the cameras paused and the crew prepared for the commercial break, something had already fundamentally changed in the First Take studio. Two people had entered that conversation as potential adversaries and were leaving as something very different. People who had chosen to elevate the level of dialogue. And the impact of that choice was just beginning. 3 minutes after First Take went off the air that March morning, ESPN's phones began ringing incessantly. They weren't the usual calls complaining about controversial takes or exaggerated provocations. It was something completely different. "My God, what just happened?" was the first message Jimmy Pitaro, ESPN's president, sent to the show's production. That was television at its finest. Because you can perceive that certain conversations transcend the medium where they happen and become something much bigger. This conversation between Steph Curry and Steph A. Smith was about to become exactly that. Within 2 hours, the clip of the conversation had been viewed more than 2 million times on YouTube, massively shared on TikTok and Twitter, and gone viral on all social media platforms. But it wasn't just the number of views that caught attention. It was the comments. For the first time in years, I saw a conversation in sports media that made me think instead of making me irritated. Steph A. being humble and Curry being wise. This is what we need more on television. Can they teach this in schools? How to have a difficult conversation without destroying the other person? Rachel Kim from ESPN tweeted, "Just watched this clip from First Take, and can confirm it was even more powerful than it appears. Two people choosing to elevate instead of destroy." Adrian Lopez, TNT analyst, posted, "This should be mandatory in journalism courses. How to transform provocation into productive conversation." Naturally, this leads us to the moment when you realize that some lessons spread far beyond where they were taught. In the weeks that followed, something subtle but significant began to happen on First Take. Steph A. Smith hadn't lost his intensity or his willingness to ask difficult questions, but there was a new quality in his approach. In an interview with LeBron James about load management, instead of attacking directly, Steph A. said, "LeBron, help me understand your perspective on this, because I know there are people who question." In a conversation with Giannis Antetokounmpo about pressure to win championships, he began with, "Giannis, this is a question that might sound confrontational, but it comes from a place of genuine curiosity." Marcus Williams, watching these interviews, commented to a colleague, "It's like he learned to maintain the same energy, but changed the intention behind it." Molly Karam noticed too. Steph A. still asks the difficult questions, she said on an internal ESPN podcast, but now he creates space for genuine answers instead of just looking for reactions. The change wasn't limited to First Take. Other ESPN shows began referencing the Curry-Steph A. conversation as an example of how to conduct difficult debates. Skip Bayless on Fox Sports commented during Undisputed, "Look, Steph A. and I have our differences, but I have to give credit where credit is due. That conversation with Curry was a television masterpiece." Rachel Nichols included a segment called Elevated Conversations on her podcast, directly inspired by the interaction she had witnessed. Even Greg Popovich, known for his dry responses to media, commented, "Maybe if more journalists approached difficult conversations the way I saw on that show, I'd be more collaborative too." How is it possible for a single 15-minute conversation to influence an entire industry? The answer was manifesting in real time. 6 months after the conversation, something even more surprising happened. Universities began using the clip in communication courses. Dr. Amanda Foster, professor of interpersonal communication at Stanford University, explained, "What Curry and Steph A. demonstrated was a masterclass in how to transform confrontation into connection. We use this as an example in our classes about conflict resolution." Companies began including the video in leadership training. Microsoft used excerpts from the conversation in workshops on difficult conversations in the corporate environment. A high school in Chicago created a program called Project Curry-Smith, where students practiced transforming heated discussions into productive dialogues. Something that touches deeply is how certain lessons become bigger than their original creators, gaining a life of their own and impacting people who will never meet the people who inspired them. A year after the conversation, Steph Curry and Steph A. Smith met again. This time at All-Star Weekend in Indianapolis. It was a casual meeting at the hotel, but Marcus Williams, who was present, later described it as one of the most genuine moments I've ever witnessed. "Steph A.," Curry said, extending his hand to greet him. "How are you doing, man?" Steph A. smiled. Not the television smile, but something much more personal. "Steph, can I tell you something? That conversation changed the way I approach my work. For real." "For me too," Curry responded. "It made me think more about how I use the platforms I have to talk about things that really matter." They talked for 15 minutes about family, purpose, and the responsibility that comes with public platforms. It was a natural continuation of the conversation they had started a year before. "You know," Steph A. said before they said goodbye, "I'm always going to ask difficult questions. It's who I am. But now I think more about why I'm asking these questions. And I'm always going to try to answer with honesty," Curry responded. "Sometimes that's going to mean challenging you back." "I hope so," Steph A. laughed. "Some of the best conversations happen when both people are willing to be challenged." 2 years after the original conversation, it had become something much bigger than a viral moment. It had become a model. When young athletes entered the league, veterans showed them the clip as an example of how to handle provocative questions. When beginning journalists started their careers, editors showed them the conversation as an example of how to ask difficult questions while maintaining integrity. The phrase, "some questions are asked to destroy, others to build wisdom," had become almost a mantra in professional communication circles. Dr. Robert Kim, organizational communication specialist at Harvard Business School, wrote an academic article titled "The Curry-Smith Effect: How Authentic Vulnerability Can Transform Antagonistic Dialogue." It's impossible not to feel how certain ideas, once released into the world, gain their own momentum and begin to influence situations their original creators never imagined. Perhaps the most significant impact was on young athletes and journalists who grew up seeing that conversation as normal instead of exceptional. Tyler Brooks, a young reporter who began covering the NBA years later, said in an interview, "I grew up watching that conversation between Curry and Steph A. It defined my expectation of what sports journalism can be, when it's done with intention." Liam Rodriguez, a young player drafted by the Warriors years later, commented, "When difficult moments came with the media, I always remembered how Curry transformed an attack question into an opportunity to share something real." The conversation had become a living legacy, influencing not only the people who witnessed it, but the generations that came after. Some years after the original conversation, Steph A. Smith was invited to give a lecture at Northwestern University's School of Journalism. During the question and answer session, a student asked about the Curry moment. "That conversation," Steph A. said, his voice carrying a gravity that wasn't present in his television appearances, "taught me that the difference between being a provocateur and being a communicator is in the intention." He paused, looking at the students in the audience. You can ask the most difficult questions in the world. You can challenge anyone about anything. But ask yourselves, am I doing this to reveal truth, to better understand, to create a conversation that elevates all people involved? Or am I doing this just to create drama? A student raised their hand. And how do you know the difference? Steph A. smiled. Steph Curry taught me that you know by how you feel afterward. If you come out of a conversation feeling bigger, not because you won, but because you learned something, then you asked the right question. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, Steph Curry continued playing basketball at 39 years old, still guided by the same passion he had described that March morning years before. In interviews, he occasionally mentioned that conversation with Steph A. as an example of how difficult moments can become opportunities for growth. His question was provocative, Curry said in a recent interview, but it ended up giving me a platform to talk about something I really cared about. And it seems like that resonated with people in ways none of us expected. The conversation had proven something that both men took into their lives: that it's possible to maintain intensity and respect at the same time, that it's possible to challenge and elevate simultaneously, that it's possible to transform potential confrontation into genuine connection. Molly Karam, now executive producer of her own media company, frequently cited that morning as the moment that redefined what I believed was possible on television. They proved, she said, in an interview for Variety, that audiences respond to authenticity even more than to drama, that people want to see real growth, not just superficial entertainment. Today, whenever someone asks about the secret to having difficult conversations productively, inevitably someone mentions the Curry-Steph A conversation. It became shorthand for a specific type of communication: honest, challenging, but fundamentally respectful. Schools across the country have programs inspired by those 15 minutes of television. Companies train leaders using principles that emerged from that conversation. Even families use the lessons to navigate difficult discussions around the dinner table. Some questions are asked to destroy, others to build wisdom. And thanks to a March morning in 2024, millions of people learned the difference. What began as an attempt at provocation transformed into a masterclass about the power of choice. The choice of how to respond when challenged. The i.e. choice of how to ask questions when curious. The choice to elevate instead of destroy. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all. That in any conversation, at any moment, we always have the choice to build bridges instead of walls. Steph Curry and Steph A. Smith, without planning, created a blueprint for the future of human communication. And that blueprint continues to influence conversations around the world, one respectful interaction at a time. Some conversations change lives. This one changed how an entire generation learned to converse.